I'm Helen Foster, 67, a retired teacher who believed my husband died, a hero trying to save his coworkers in that devastating factory fire. For 3 months, I grieved the man I thought I knew until his boss appeared at my door with a briefcase full of cash and a chilling demand for my silence. The money was supposed to help me move on, but what I discovered about that fire, about David, and about the company he worked for, would shatter everything I thought I knew about my life. Some secrets are worth more than any amount of money, and some truths demand to be told, no matter the cost. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever wondered what you'd do when faced with choosing between financial security and justice, like this video. That Tuesday morning started like any other in our 43 years of marriage. David's metal lunchbox sat on the kitchen counter, the same scratched blue Coleman he'd carried since 1985. I'd packed his usual turkey sandwich, apple, thermos of coffee, and a note reminding him about dinner with our daughter Sarah that weekend. "You spoil me, Helen," he said, kissing my cheek as he grabbed his coat. At 70, David still moved with the steady confidence of a man who'd worked with his hands his entire life. 28 years at Meridian Manufacturing, starting as a floor worker and working his way up to safety inspector. "Drive careful," I called from the doorway, watching his truck disappear down Maple Street. I'd spent the morning grading papers, old habits from my teaching days, and planning my garden for spring. The phone rang at 2:47 p.m. I remember because I glanced at the clock, annoyed at the interruption. "Mrs. Foster, this is Captain Rodriguez with the fire department." The words that followed became a blur. Fire at the plant. Multiple casualties. David listed among the missing. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking as the receiver clattered against the kitchen floor. The drive to Meridian Manufacturing felt endless. Smoke billowed black against the October sky, and emergency vehicles lined Industrial Boulevard. Police barricades kept families like me at a distance, but I could see the devastation: twisted metal, shattered windows, the acrid smell of burned chemicals hanging in the air. A Red Cross volunteer draped a blanket around my shoulders as we waited for news. Other wives stood nearby, their faces mirrors of my own terror. Mrs. Chen from the church, Maria Santos, whose husband worked the night shift. We'd become unwilling members of a club none of us wanted to join. Hours passed before they found David's body in the East Wing, where he shouldn't have been. The fire chief explained he'd likely gone back to help evacuate others. Typical David, always putting everyone else first. That night, I sat in our empty house, still wearing the clothes I'd thrown on that morning. David's lunchbox remained on the counter, untouched. I opened it with trembling fingers. The sandwich sat there, perfectly preserved, along with my note about dinner plans we'd never keep. I held that lunchbox against my chest and wept until I had no tears left. The funeral home overflowed with mourners. David had touched so many lives during his decades at Meridian and in our community. Former students of mine, neighbors, his bowling league teammates, they all came to pay their respects to the man they called a hero. Pastor Williams delivered a beautiful eulogy about David's character and sacrifice. "David Foster embodied the best of us," he said, his voice carrying across the packed chapel. "In his final moments, he chose to save others rather than himself. Greater love has no one than this." The company sent their entire management team. Mr. Richardson, the plant manager, sat in the front row with his executives, their faces appropriately somber. During the service, he approached me with what seemed like genuine tears. "Mrs. Foster, your husband was one of our finest employees," he said, gripping my hands. "His dedication to safety made our workplace better for everyone. We're establishing a memorial fund in his honor." I nodded, too numb to respond. The grief felt like drowning waves of pain washing over me when I least expected them. The honor guard presented me with the folded American flag. David had served 2 tours in Vietnam before we met. The crisp triangles of red, white, and blue felt impossibly heavy in my hands as the bugler played taps. Our daughter Sarah sobbed beside me, her husband Mark trying to comfort us both. After the graveside service, people shared their memories. Coworker after coworker spoke of David's integrity, his commitment to keeping everyone safe. Miguel Santos, one of the survivors, could barely speak through his tears. "Mr. David, he saved my life," Miguel said in broken English. "The alarm, it wasn't working right. He came to get me. If not for him, he couldn't finish." his wife Carmen wrapping him in her arms, but something felt wrong. Small details that didn't quite fit the heroic narrative everyone was building. Why had David been in the East Wing when his workstation was in the North Building? Why had the safety alarms malfunctioned? And why did some of his coworkers avoid my eyes when they offered their condolences? Richardson approached me again as the crowd thinned. "Mrs. Foster, the company wants to take care of you. David's pension and insurance will help, but we know this is a difficult time financially. We'll be in touch soon about additional support." I thanked him, though his words felt hollow. Everyone was being so kind, so helpful, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was being left unsaid. That evening, I sat alone in our bedroom, David's work clothes still hanging in the closet. In the pocket of his safety jacket, I found his reading glasses, the ones he used for inspecting equipment and filling out reports. They were cracked, one lens missing entirely. I held them up to the light, wondering what David had been looking at in his final moments. The weeks blurred together in a haze of casseroles and sympathy cards, our house filled with flowers that eventually wilted and died, much like my motivation to face each day. I'd taught high school English for 35 years, but retirement had never felt this empty. The insurance money helped with immediate expenses, but David's pension wasn't enough to cover the mortgage and medical bills that kept arriving. At 67, I'd never worried about money before. David had always handled our finances with the same methodical care he brought to his safety inspections. Sarah called daily, begging me to move in with her family in Portland. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone in that big house," she'd say. But leaving felt like abandoning David somehow. Our memories lived in these walls, his coffee mug still in the sink, his favorite chair worn smooth from decades of youth. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake remembering fragments of our last conversations, searching for clues I might have missed. David had seemed troubled in the weeks before the fire. Taking phone calls he'd step outside to answer. When I asked about work, he'd change the subject or claim everything was fine. "Just some new regulations," he'd said when I pressed him about working late. "Lots of paperwork to catch up on." The strange behavior from his coworkers continued. At the grocery store, I'd spot Miguel Santos or Frank Turner, men who'd worked alongside David for years. They'd nod politely but hurry past, avoiding real conversation. The easy familiarity we'd shared at company picnics and retirement parties had vanished. When Carmen Santos saw me at church, she looked almost frightened. "Mrs. Foster," she whispered, glancing round nervously. "Miguel, he wants to talk to you." But she stopped herself, shaking her head. "I'm sorry for your loss," she finished quickly. Hurrying away, I started going through David's things more carefully, hoping to understand his final weeks. In his desk drawer, I found receipts for certified mail he'd never mentioned sending. There were notes scrawled in his careful handwriting. Check valve pressure readings and ask about maintenance schedule. Nothing that seemed significant, but evidence of concerns he'd never shared with me. His work badge lay in the drawer, a plastic rectangle with his photo from 5 years ago, when his hair was still more brown than gray. The magnetic strip was worn from decades of daily use. I noticed something odd. His clearance level was listed as level 3, which seemed higher than what a safety inspector would need. When had that changed? Winter settled over our small town, matching my internal landscape. The investigation into the fire had concluded too quickly. Some people whispered, "electrical malfunction." The official report stated, "no evidence of negligence or safety violations." But if that were true, why did I feel like everyone was keeping secrets from me? And why did David's cracked reading glasses suggest he'd been looking at something important right before everything went wrong? The isolation grew heavier each day. Friends meant well, but their sympathy felt suffocating. I needed answers more than comfort, truth more than kindness. As the 3-month anniversary of the fire approached, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out what really happened to my husband. The doorbell rang on a gray Thursday afternoon in January, exactly 3 months and 2 days after the fire. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I considered not answering. But through the peephole, I recognized the tall, figure of James Richardson, Meridian Manufacturing's plant manager. "Mrs. Foster, I hope I'm not intruding," he said when I opened the door. He wore an expensive overcoat and carried a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than my monthly pension. I was wondering if we could talk privately about David and the company's ongoing support for his family. I invited him into the living room, where he declined coffee and sat stiffly on the edge of David's favorite armchair. Something about his presence felt wrong, too formal, too calculated. This wasn't a social call. Helen May, I call you Helen. I want to start by saying again how sorry we all are about David's loss. He was truly irreplaceable. Thank you, I replied, waiting for him to get to the point. Richardson opened his briefcase and withdrew a manila folder. The company has been reviewing David's years of service, and we feel the standard death benefits don't adequately reflect his contribution to Meridian. We'd like to offer you additional compensation. He slid a document across the coffee table. The letterhead read Confidential Settlement Agreement, and I could see numbers with lots of zeros. My hands trembled as I picked it up. $50,000, Richardson said quietly, to help with your transition and ensure your financial security. All we ask is that you sign this agreement acknowledging that the company fulfilled all safety obligations and that David's death was purely accidental. I stared at the paper, my teacher's instincts recognizing manipulation disguised as generosity. Why would you need me to sign something like this? Richardson's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew cold. It's simply a formality, Helen. Legal departments require these things. The money is yours regardless. We just need to close the file properly. And if I don't sign, the silence stretched between us like a chasm. When Richardson finally spoke, his voice carried a subtle threat beneath the polite words. Well, that would be unfortunate. You see, there are always people who try to blame companies for tragic accidents. They file lawsuits, make wild accusations, drag grieving families through years of painful litigation. The media gets involved, turns decent people into villains. It can get very ugly, very expensive. He leaned forward slightly. I'd hate to see you go through that kind of ordeal. At your age, dealing with aggressive lawyers and depositions, it would be such a shame, especially when there's really nothing to find. The investigation was thorough. The fire was an accident, pure and simple. My heart pounded as I realized what was happening. This wasn't generosity, it was a bribe. Richardson wasn't here to help me. He was here to silence me. I need time to think about this, I said, setting the document aside. Richardson's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing irritation beneath the practiced sympathy. Of course, take all the time you need. But Helen, please understand this offer won't remain open indefinitely. The company has been very patient, very generous. We hope you'll see this as the gift it's meant to be. He stood, closing his briefcase with a sharp click. I'll be in touch next week for your decision. And Helen, I do hope you'll make the right choice, for everyone's sake. After he left, I sat in the growing darkness, the settlement agreement lying on the table like a poisonous snake. $50,000 to stay quiet about questions I'd barely begun to ask. $50,000 to accept that my husband's death was just an unfortunate accident. But if it really was an accident, why did they need my silence? I picked up David's cracked reading glasses from the mantel, holding them to catch the lamplight. Whatever he'd been looking at in those final moments, it was important enough that someone wanted to make sure I never found out what it was. That night, I made a decision that would have made my late husband proud. I wasn't going to take their money. I was going to find the truth. I couldn't sleep that night. Richardson's words echoed in my mind. But it wasn't just his veiled threats that kept me awake. It was the growing certainty that everything I'd been told about David's death was a lie. At dawn, I made coffee and spread David's work materials. Across the kitchen table, his safety inspector badge lay among the papers, and I studied it more carefully in the morning light. The photo showed his familiar face, but the details troubled me. Level 3 clearance meant access to restricted areas, sensitive equipment, confidential reports. When had David's responsibilities expanded so dramatically? I called Meridian's Human Resources Department, introducing myself as David's widow needing information for insurance purposes. The young woman who answered was helpful but confused. I'm sorry, Mrs. Foster, but Mr. Foster's badge shows Level 1 clearance standard for safety inspectors. Are you sure you're reading it correctly? I looked at the badge again. Level 3 was clearly printed there. Could you check his file again? Maybe there was a recent promotion. Let me transfer you to his supervisor. The line went dead. When I called back, I was told the supervisor was unavailable and someone would return my call. No one ever did. I decided to visit places David had mentioned in his final weeks. He'd been spending time at Murphy's Diner, a greasy spoon near the plant where workers gathered for coffee and conversation. The owner, Betty Murphy, had known David for years. "Helen, honey, I'm so sorry," Betty said, pouring me coffee without asking. "David was in here just a few days before the fire. Seemed real troubled about something. Did he say what was bothering him?" Betty glanced around the nearly empty diner, then leaned closer. "He was asking questions about the other incidents, the accidents over the past few years. Wanted to know if any of the families had been contacted by company lawyers." "What other accidents?" "Oh, sweetie, there's been a string of them. Nothing as big as the fire, but still, Joe Martinez fell into a chemical vat 2 years ago. The Kowalski boy got crushed by faulty machinery last spring. Always ruled accidental. Always happened to workers who'd been asking questions about safety protocols." My coffee grew cold as Betty continued. "David had a notebook with him that last day, writing down names, dates. He seemed scared, but determined, like he'd figured something out. A notebook. I'd never found any notebook among David's things. Had it been lost in the fire, or had someone made sure it disappeared?" That afternoon, I drove to the plant for the first time since the fire. The east wing had been demolished, but temporary structures housed the continued operations. I parked across the street, watching workers arrive for the evening shift. Miguel Santos emerged from the main building, lunch cooler in hand. Our eyes met across the parking lot, and I saw recognition and fear flash across his face. He started toward his truck, but I crossed the street quickly. "Miguel, please, I need to talk to you about David." He stopped, looking around nervously. "Mrs. Foster, I'm sorry, but I can't. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." His shoulders sagged. "Not here. Meet me at St. Mary's Church in an hour. I'll tell you what I can." Back home, I searched David's belongings more thoroughly. In the garage, behind his tool chest, I found a small cardboard box I'd missed before. Inside were photocopies of maintenance, reports, safety inspection forms, and incident documentation, all marked with David's handwritten notes. The papers painted a disturbing picture. Equipment failures that had been ignored, safety violations that had been covered up, maintenance schedules that had been falsified to save money. David had been documenting systematic negligence, building a case that could have shut down Meridian Manufacturing. At the bottom of the box was a business card for Jennifer Walsh, an investigative reporter with the state newspaper. David had written on the back, "Call if something happens to me." My hands shook as I realized the full scope of what David had discovered. He hadn't died trying to save his coworkers from an accidental fire. He'd died because he'd threatened to expose corporate crimes that went back years, and now they wanted to pay me to stay quiet about it. I slipped David's work badge into my purse and headed for St. Mary's Church, knowing that whatever Miguel told me would change everything. St. Mary's stood empty except for Miguel Santos, who knelt in the front pew with his head bowed. I slipped into the row behind him, the familiar scent of incense and old wood bringing unexpected comfort. "Mrs. Foster," he whispered without turning round, "I've been praying for forgiveness every day since the fire. For David, for the others, for my own cowardice. Miguel, what really happened that day?" He crossed himself before turning to face me, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Your husband. He was a good man, a brave man. He tried to save us all, but not from the fire, from something much worse." Miguel reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper, worn soft from handling. "I wrote this down the day after the fire, while it was still fresh. I was going to give it to the investigators, but then," he shook his head, "they made it clear that some truths were too dangerous to tell." I unfolded the paper, recognizing Miguel's careful handwriting. It was titled, "What Really Happened at Meridian Manufacturing, October 15th. "Read it," Miguel said, "but understand, once you know this, they'll come for you too." The handwritten account began 3 weeks before the fire. When David had approached Miguel about safety violations, he'd discovered faulty gas lines that should have been replaced years ago, pressure valves that had been jury-rigged to pass inspections, chemical storage tanks that exceeded safe capacity limits. "Mr. David," he showed me the real maintenance records, Miguel continued. "Not the ones they kept for inspectors, the internal ones that showed how bad things really were. Equipment failures happening every week, but the reports never got filed. Workers getting hurt, but the accidents never got reported to OSHA." According to Miguel's testimony, David had been systematically documenting violations for months, building an airtight case. He'd discovered that Meridian had been falsifying safety reports for nearly 5 years, saving millions in required upgrades and repairs. He found out about the other workers too, Miguel said. Joe Martinez didn't fall into that chemical vat. He was pushed. The Kowalski boys' accident wasn't equipment failure. Someone disabled the safety mechanisms. Anyone who got too close to the truth, they found a way to silence them. The fire itself hadn't been accidental either. David had called a meeting with several workers for that Tuesday afternoon, planning to reveal everything he'd discovered and organize a group to contact federal investigators. But someone had learned about the meeting. They rigged the gas lines in the East Wing, Miguel whispered, made it look like an equipment malfunction, but it was planned. They knew Mr. David would be there at exactly 2:30 p.m. I felt sick reading the details. David hadn't died saving his coworkers. He'd died because he'd threatened to expose the company's crimes. The other casualties were collateral damage. Innocent people who'd been in the wrong place when corporate killers decided to silence a whistleblower. Why didn't you tell someone? I asked. Miguel's laugh was bitter. Who was I going to tell? The fire investigator who wrapped up his report in 2 days. The police chief whose brother-in-law works for Meridian. The mayor who gets campaign contributions from Richardson every election. He explained how Richardson had visited each surviving worker individually, offering promotions and bonuses to those who stayed quiet, threatening termination and blacklisting for those who asked questions. Miguel had 5 children and a sick wife. He couldn't afford to lose his job or face retaliation. But your husband, Mrs. Foster, he wouldn't have wanted his death to be for nothing. He was going to contact a reporter, Jennifer Walsh from the Tribune. He said she was the only one he trusted to tell the real story. I showed Miguel the business card I'd found. He left this for me to find. Then you know what you have to do. Miguel said, Mr. David died trying to protect all of us. If you don't finish what he started, more people will die. The problems he found they're still there. The company just covered them up better after the fire. Miguel stood to leave, then turned back one final time. Mrs. Forster, they offered you money, didn't they, to stay quiet? I nodded. They offered me a promotion to supervisor, double my salary. But every time I look at my children, I see Mr. David's face. Some things are worth more than money. Some truths are worth the risk. As Miguel walked away, I remained in the pew, holding his testimony and feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. David had died fighting for justice, trying to protect his fellow workers from corporate greed and negligence. Now, it was my turn to decide whether his sacrifice would mean something or whether Richardson's blood money would buy the silence that would let the killing continue. Armed with Miguel's testimony and David's hidden documents, I began my own investigation. My decades as a high school teacher had taught me patience and methodical research skills that served me well as I dug deeper into Meridian Manufacturing's dark secrets. The county clerk's office became my second home. Public records revealed a disturbing pattern of workplace incidents at Meridian over the past 5 years, each one officially ruled accidental, each one involving workers who'd previously filed safety complaints. Joe Martinez had submitted 3 formal grievances about chemical storage violations before his accidental death. Tommy Kowalski had reported faulty machinery to his supervisor the week before he was killed. Sarah Chen had documented improper ventilation systems before succumbing to what was labeled sudden respiratory failure. The safety inspection reports told their own story. Every 6 months, state inspectors visited Meridian and found everything in perfect compliance. But the dates of these inspections followed a predictable pattern. We scheduled weeks in advance, giving the company time to temporarily fix problems and hide violations. I cross-referenced the inspection dates with maintenance records I'd found in David's files. The pattern was clear. Costly repairs would be completed just before inspections, then immediately reversed to save money. It was an elaborate shell game designed to fool regulators while maximizing profits. At the public library, I researched Meridian's corporate structure. The company was owned by Titan Industries, a multinational conglomerate with facilities across 3 states. Searching newspaper archives, I found similar accidents at other Titan plants. Suspicious fires, equipment failures, chemical spills, always in facilities where workers had been pushing for safety improvements. The financial motive became clear when I accessed Meridian's public filings. The safety upgrades David had been pushing for would have cost approximately $12 million. By falsifying reports and eliminating whistleblowers, The company had saved millions while putting hundreds of workers at risk. I made copies of everything, organizing the evidence in manila folders, labeled with each victim's name. David's file was the thickest, containing his handwritten notes documenting specific violations, photographed evidence of faulty equipment, and correspondence with federal agencies that had apparently been ignored. One document particularly caught my attention: a memo from Richardson to Titan's corporate headquarters, dated 2 weeks before the fire. The subject line read, "Foster problem, immediate action required." The memo itself was heavily redacted, but the visible portions made Richardson's concerns clear. David's investigation threatened to expose systemic issues that could result in criminal liability and massive financial penalties. The final paragraph chilled me to the bone. Recommend immediate intervention before Foster contacts external authorities. Situation requires permanent resolution. I photocopied the memo with shaking hands, understanding that I now held evidence of premeditated murder disguised as corporate correspondence. But gathering evidence was only half the battle. I needed to find someone with the power and courage to act on what I'd discovered. Local authorities were clearly compromised. Richardson's influence ran too deep in our small town. I called the state attorney general's office, but my concerns were shuffled between junior staffers who seemed more interested in protecting their careers than pursuing justice. The federal OSHA office in the state capital promised to look into the matter, but warned that investigations could take years that would give Meridian time to destroy evidence, silence witnesses, and possibly eliminate other threats in me. That's when I remembered Jennifer Walsh, the investigative reporter whose card David had kept. I found her articles online, impressed by her thorough reporting on corporate malfeasance and environmental crimes. She had a reputation for taking on powerful interests and protecting her sources. I drafted a careful email, attaching Miguel's testimony and selected documents from David's files. I explained my husband's death and the pattern of violence against workers who threatened to expose Meridian's crimes. I offered to provide additional evidence and witness testimony in exchange for protection and a commitment to publish the truth. Her response came within hours. "Mrs. Foster, I've been following rumors about Titan Industries for 2 years. Your husband's story could be the key to exposing a criminal conspiracy that extends far beyond your local plant. Can we meet in person? I believe both our lives may depend on how carefully we proceed." As I prepared for that meeting, I realized I'd crossed a line. I was no longer just a grieving widow seeking answers. I was a threat to powerful people who'd already killed to protect their secrets. But David had been willing to risk everything for the truth. Now it was my turn to finish what he'd started, no matter the cost. My research had uncovered the names of other widows whose husbands had died in suspicious workplace accidents at Titan facilities. I decided to reach out, hoping to find allies who might help expose the pattern of corporate murder. Betty Martinez lived 2 counties over, in a small apartment that spoke of financial struggle. When I called, explaining who I was and why I wanted to meet, her voice turned cold with fear. "I can't talk about Joe's death," she said quickly. "I signed papers. If I say anything, they'll take away my settlement money." "Betty, I think they killed our husbands. Doesn't that matter more than money?" A long silence followed. Finally, she whispered, "Come tomorrow at noon. Park 2 blocks away and walk to the apartment. Don't let anyone see you." Betty's story mirrored my own experience. After Joe's death, Titan representatives had appeared with condolences and cash, requiring her signature on confidentiality agreements in exchange for enhanced death benefits. She'd been struggling financially, working 2 jobs to support her teenage daughters. The money had seemed like salvation. "But I knew something was wrong," Betty said, showing me a faded photograph of her late husband. "Joe was scared the month before he died. He kept talking about problems at the plant, safety violations he'd reported that got ignored. He said if anything happened to him, I should contact a reporter." She led me to a closet and pulled out a shoebox hidden behind winter coats. Inside were Joe's work notes, documenting chemical spills, improper disposal procedures, and maintenance shortcuts that saved money but endangered lives. "Joe found out they were dumping toxic waste into the groundwater," Betty explained. "He reported it to his supervisor, but nothing changed. The night before he died, he said he was going to call the EPA. Joe's accident had occurred the next morning when he allegedly fell into a chemical vat, but his notes suggested he'd been investigating that exact area documenting violations for his planned EPA report. They gave me $40,000 to stay quiet, Betty said. I was a single mother with 2 kids heading to college. What choice did I have? I understood her dilemma, but I also understood that her silence and the silence of others like her had enabled the killing to continue. Betty, what if I told you there might be a way to expose them without losing your settlement money? What if we could save other families from going through what we've been through? She studied her husband's photograph for a long moment. What did you have in mind? I explained my contact with Jennifer Walsh and the evidence I'd been gathering. Betty's documentation of environmental crimes added another dimension to the story. Titan wasn't just killing workers, they were poisoning entire communities. There's strength in numbers, I said. One widow making accusations can be dismissed as grief-stricken or money-hungry. But multiple families with similar stories and documentation, that's harder to ignore. Betty agreed to think about it, and I left with copies of Joe's environmental evidence. My next stop was the Kowalski family, whose son Tommy had died in the machinery accident. Anna Kowalski was harder to convince. Her family had received a $100,000 settlement, enough to pay off their mortgage and send their remaining children to college. The confidentiality agreement she'd signed was ironclad, with severe financial penalties for violation. Tommy's dead, she said bluntly. No amount of investigation will bring him back. My living children need security more than they need justice. I understood her position, but I pressed gently. What about the other mothers whose sons are still alive? The ones who could be saved if we stopped this pattern? Anna's resolve wavered when I showed her evidence of other deaths at Titan facilities. The scope of the conspiracy was larger than any individual tragedy. It was systematic corporate murder disguised as workplace safety failures. How many more families have to suffer before someone stands up to them? I asked. By the end of our conversation, Anna had agreed to provide testimony and documentation, though she insisted on anonymity until we could guarantee legal protection for whistleblowers. My final visit was to the Chen family. Sarah Chun had died 3 years ago from sudden respiratory failure. After reporting ventilation problems in the chemical processing area, her widower, Dr. William Chen, had used his settlement money to establish a nonprofit advocating for workplace safety, a legal way to fight the system without violating his confidentiality agreement. I've been waiting for someone like you, Dr. Chun said when I explained my investigation. Someone with the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost. He showed me medical records that contradicted the official cause of Sarah's death. Her symptoms were consistent with exposure to specific industrial toxins, not the sudden illness claimed by company doctors. I'm a physician, Dr. Chen explained. I know poisoning when I see it. But the autopsy was performed by the county coroner, who happens to be Richardson's golf partner. The results were predetermined. Dr. Chun's nonprofit had been quietly documenting suspicious deaths at industrial facilities across the region. His research revealed a pattern of cover-ups involving medical examiners, insurance companies, and regulatory agencies, all with financial ties to Titan Industries. They've built a network of corruption, he said. But networks can be exposed if you know where to look. As I drove home that evening, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. I was no longer fighting just for David's memory. I was fighting for all the families who'd been silenced by corporate power and all the workers who remained in danger. Betty Martinez's photograph of her late husband sat on my passenger seat, a reminder that behind every covered-up death was a family torn apart by greed and lies. Tomorrow, I would call Jennifer Walsh and arrange our meeting. The Widows Network was ready to speak truth to power, no matter the consequences. Before meeting with Jennifer Walsh, I decided to explore legal options. Surely with the evidence I'd gathered, some attorney would be willing to take on Meridian Manufacturing and Titan Industries. My first stop was Henderson & Associates, the largest law firm in our county. Robert Henderson had handled our wills and estate planning for 20 years. I trusted him to give me honest advice about pursuing wrongful death litigation. Henderson's reaction to my evidence was immediate and disappointing. He barely glanced at Miguel's testimony before setting it aside, his expression growing increasingly uncomfortable as I explained my discoveries. Helen, I understand you're grieving, but you need to be very careful about making serious accusations without absolute proof, he said carefully. Meridian Manufacturing employs half this county. They're respected corporate citizens who contribute significantly to our community. They murdered my husband, I said flatly. Henderson winced. That's exactly the kind of statement that could get you sued for defamation. Helen, I strongly advise you to accept the company's settlement offer and try to move on with your life. You're not going to help me. I can't, in good conscience, encourage what amounts to a vendetta against a major employer. Besides, Titan Industries has teams of corporate lawyers who would bury you in paperwork and legal costs. You'd spend your life savings and accomplish nothing. I left Henderson's office understanding that local legal help was impossible. Meridian's influence ran too deep in our small community. My next attempt was the state capitol, where I met with Patricia Graves, a lawyer who specialized in workplace safety litigation. Her initial enthusiasm waned quickly when I mentioned Titan Industries. Mrs. Foster, I've tangled with Titan before, she said, reviewing my documents. They don't just fight cases, they destroy opponents. My last client against them ended up bankrupted, blacklisted, and had his reputation destroyed by a targeted media campaign. But you won the case. We won a small settlement after 3 years of litigation that cost my client everything. Titan's strategy isn't to win in court, it's to make the cost of fighting them unbearable. She explained how Titan's legal strategy worked. They would file countersuits for defamation, claim trade secret violations, and demand depositions that forced plaintiffs to spend thousands on legal fees. They'd drag cases out for years, knowing most people couldn't afford extended litigation. They have a team of private investigators who dig into plaintiffs' lives, looking for anything embarrassing or compromising. They'll attack your character, your motives, your mental state. They'll claim you're a grieving widow who's lost touch with reality. Patricia's warnings were sobering, but she offered one glimmer of hope. Federal authorities might be different. If you can get the FBI or EPA interested, they have resources to match Titan's legal firepower, but you'd need overwhelming evidence and a prosecutor willing to take career risks. My third consultation was with Marcus Webb, a civil rights attorney who'd successfully sued major corporations in environmental cases. He was the first lawyer who seemed genuinely interested in my evidence. This documentation is impressive, Webb said, studying David's files. But here's the problem: most of your evidence would be inadmissible in court. Your husband's notes are hearsay. Miguel's testimony could be dismissed as the account of a disgruntled employee. The company will claim these documents were fabricated or taken out of context. What about the other families? The pattern of deaths? Circumstantial at best. Each case was officially ruled accidental. You'd need to prove criminal conspiracy, which requires evidence of intent and coordination. That's a very high legal bar. Webb paused, studying a document more carefully. However, this memo from Richardson is interesting. If we could authenticate it and prove it refers to your husband, it might constitute evidence of criminal conspiracy. He explained that the memo would need to be forensically analyzed, its authenticity verified through expert testimony. Even then, Titan's lawyers would argue it was taken out of context or referred to some other business matter. The legal system is designed to protect corporate interests, Webb said bluntly. Companies like Titan have learned to operate within the bounds of what's technically legal, even when their actions are morally reprehensible. So there's no justice for families like mine. Legal justice is difficult, but not impossible. You'd need a prosecutor willing to pursue criminal charges, which means federal authorities. And you'd need evidence that's absolutely unimpeachable: recordings, testimony from insiders, willing to risk everything. As I left Webb's office, I carried a rejection letter he'd written, explaining why he couldn't take my case. The letter cited insufficient admissible evidence and practical concerns about opposing well-funded corporate defendants. The legal system had failed me completely. 3 attorneys had essentially told me the same thing. Titan Industries was too powerful, too connected, too wealthy to challenge through normal legal channels. But failure in the courts didn't mean failure everywhere. Jennifer Walsh represented a different kind of justice, the court of public opinion, where evidence could be presented without legal technicalities, where the truth could be told even if it couldn't be proven beyond reasonable doubt. That evening, I called Jennifer and scheduled our meeting for the following week. If the legal system wouldn't protect workers from corporate killers, perhaps investigative journalism could expose the truth and force accountability through public outrage. David had been willing to risk everything for justice. Now I understood that the legal system itself was part of the problem, corrupted by corporate influence and designed to protect the wealthy from consequences. But truth had power too, and I was determined to wield it. While preparing for my meeting, with Jennifer Walsh, I decided to conduct one final search of David's belongings. Something had been nagging at me, the feeling that I'd missed something important, some crucial piece of evidence that would tie everything together. I started in his workshop, methodically examining every toolbox, every drawer, every corner where he might have hidden something. David had been meticulous about organization, but in the weeks before his death, his usual order had given way to nervous energy and secretive behavior. Behind his workbench, I discovered a loose floorboard that creaked differently than the others. Using a crowbar, I pried it up and found a small waterproof box hidden in the cavity below. Inside was a prepaid cell phone I'd never seen before. My hands trembled as I powered it on, praying the battery still held enough charge. The phone contained dozens of text messages, voice recordings, and photographs that painted a devastating picture of David's final investigation. The text messages revealed David's correspondence with other workers across multiple Titan facilities. He'd been coordinating with safety inspectors, maintenance workers, and supervisors who'd discovered similar patterns of negligence and cover-ups at plants in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. One conversation with a worker named Frank Rodriguez was particularly chilling. "David, they killed Jimmy Chen last week." Made it look like equipment failure, but the safety locks were deliberately disabled. "I've got photos of the sabotage, but I'm scared to come forward. They're watching everyone who asks questions." David's response showed his determination. "Frank, I'm documenting everything. We need to coordinate our evidence and go public simultaneously. They can't silence all of us at once." The voice recordings were even more damning. David had secretly recorded conversations with supervisors who admitted to falsifying safety reports, maintenance workers who'd been ordered to ignore dangerous conditions, and even a meeting with Richardson where the plant manager explicitly threatened David's job if he continued his troublemaking. But the photographs were the smoking gun. I'd been looking for David had systematically documented every safety violation at Meridian, using his Level 3 access to photograph areas that normal inspectors never saw. The images showed gas lines held together with duct tape, chemical storage tanks corroded beyond safe limits, and electrical systems jury-rigged with dangerous shortcuts. One series of photos, dated 3 days before the fire, showed the exact area where the accidental explosion had occurred. The images clearly revealed that someone had deliberately damaged gas connections and disabled safety shutoffs. This wasn't equipment failure, was sabotage designed to create a deadly accident. The final entry in David's phone was a voice memo recorded the morning of the fire. "Helen, if you're hearing this, it means they succeeded in silencing me. Everything you need is in this phone, and in the documents I've hidden. Contact Jennifer Walsh at the Tribune. She's the only reporter I trust to tell this story. The meeting this afternoon could be a trap, but I have to try. Too many good people have died because of corporate greed. I love you, sweetheart. Make sure my death means something." I sat in David's workshop, sobbing as I listened to his voice. One last time, he'd known he was walking into danger, but he'd gone anyway because he couldn't live with himself if more people died while he stayed silent. The phone contained contact information for workers at other Titan facilities, detailed documentation of the company's systematic safety violations, and evidence that David's murder was part of a broader pattern of eliminating whistleblowers. Most importantly, it contained the names of Titan executives who were directly involved in the cover-up conspiracy. Richardson wasn't acting alone. He was following orders from corporate headquarters, where senior managers had developed elimination protocols for dealing with problem employees. I copied everything from the phone onto my computer, then called Jennifer Walsh to move up our meeting. This evidence changed everything. David's hidden phone proved premeditated murder, systematic corporate negligence, and a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Titan Industries. "Jennifer, I've found something that will blow this story wide open," I said when she answered. "David documented everything. We have proof of murder, sabotage, and a conspiracy involving multiple facilities. Mrs. Foster, are you absolutely certain about what you've found? Once we publish this information, there's no going back. Titan will use every resource they have to destroy both of us." I thought about David's final voice message, about Miguel's fear, about all the families who'd been silenced by corporate power and blood money. "I'm certain," I said. "My husband died trying to expose these crimes. I'm going to finish what he started." The hidden phone had given me everything I needed to seek justice for David and all the other victims of Titan's greed. but it had also painted a target on my back. The people who'd killed my husband now knew I possessed evidence that could destroy them. That as I prepared for what might be my final battle, I understood that David's courage had given me both the weapons I needed and the responsibility to use them, no matter the personal cost. The truth was finally ready to come to light. The intimidation began the morning after I discovered David's hidden phone. I woke to find my front door slightly ajar, though I distinctly remembered locking it the night before. Nothing was missing, but the message was clear: they could reach me anytime they wanted. I called the police, but Officer Martinez seemed more interested in suggesting I'd simply forgotten to lock the door than investigating a possible break-in. When I insisted someone had been in my house, he recommended I see a grief counselor. Sometimes loss can make people paranoid, Mrs. Foster. It's perfectly normal to feel unsafe after what you've been through. 2 days later, I found an envelope slipped under my door with no postmark or delivery service marking. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message typed in plain block letters. Some secrets are better left buried. Think about your daughter in Portland. My blood ran cold. Sarah lived 3,000 miles away with her family, supposedly safe from whatever was happening here. The fact that they knew about her, could reach her, made this threat infinitely more terrifying than anything directed at me. I called Sarah immediately, trying to keep the fear out of my voice, as I suggested she take the kids on an impromptu vacation. Maybe visit your aunt in Colorado for a few weeks, I said casually. Mom, what's really going on? You've been acting strange since Dad's funeral. Are you in some kind of trouble? I couldn't tell her the truth without putting her in more danger, so I deflected. I'm just having a hard time being alone in the house. A change of scenery might do us both good. Sarah agreed to take the kids skiing, but her suspicious tone told me she knew I was hiding something. At least they'd be safely out of state while I dealt with whatever Titan had planned. The harassment escalated throughout the week. My phone rang at all hours with no one on the other end. My mail was clearly being intercepted. Bills that should have arrived never came, while junk mail appeared that I'd never received before. Someone was monitoring my communications and controlling what information reached me. I started varying my daily routines, taking different routes to the grocery store and library. In my rearview mirror, I noticed the same dark sedan following me on multiple occasions. When I tried to get a license plate number, the car would disappear down a side street. The psychological pressure was enormous. I found myself jumping at every unexpected sound, checking locks multiple times, pulling curtains closed even during the day. They were trying to drive me to the edge of a nervous breakdown, to make me appear unstable if I went public with my accusations. But I also discovered I wasn't entirely alone. Dr. Chen called to warn me that his nonprofit had received threatening letters similar to mine. Betty Martinez reported that men in suits had been asking her neighbors questions about her activities and visitors. They're trying to intimidate all of us, Dr. Chen explained during a careful phone conversation. But it also means they're scared. People don't threaten others unless they feel cornered. The most frightening incident occurred on a Thursday evening as I returned from the library. I found my house had been searched again, but this time the intruders had been less careful about hiding their presence. Drawers were slightly askew, papers weren't quite in the right order, and my computer had been moved. They'd been looking for David's phone, I realized. They knew I'd found something important, and they were trying to recover it before I could share it with anyone. I'd been smart enough to hide the phone and copies of its contents in a safety deposit box at a bank in the next county. The evidence was secure, but the harassment convinced me that time was running short. Titan wouldn't keep playing games indefinitely. The breaking point came when I received a call from a man with a smooth, professional voice who claimed to be from my insurance company. Mrs. Foster, we're reviewing your husband's policy and have discovered some irregularities in his death certificate. There may be questions about whether his death occurred in the line of duty, which could affect your benefits. What kind of irregularities? Well, if it turns out Mr. Foster was somewhere he shouldn't have been, engaged in activities outside his job description, the company might not be liable for death benefits. Insurance fraud is a serious federal crime, Mrs. Foster. The penalties can be quite severe. The threat was barely disguised. They were telling me that if I continued my investigation, they'd claim David had been engaged in unauthorized activities, void his insurance policy, and possibly have me prosecuted for fraud. Of course, if this was all just a tragic accident, like the official report states, there wouldn't be any problems with your benefits. Sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions about painful subjects. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen shaking with rage and fear. They were threatening my financial security, my family's safety, and my freedom. The intimidation campaign was designed to isolate me, terrorize me, and ultimately silence me just as they'd silenced David. But their desperation also revealed their vulnerability. If David's evidence wasn't damaging, they wouldn't be working so hard to suppress it. If I wasn't a real threat, they wouldn't be threatening my daughter. I called Jennifer Walsh and moved our meeting up to the next day. The intimidation campaign had convinced me that I was running out of time. If I was going to honor David's sacrifice and seek justice for all the victims of Titan's greed, I had to act before they found a way to permanently silence me. The anonymous threat letter lay on my kitchen table, a reminder that some fights are worth the risk. David had been willing to die for the truth. I was prepared to do the same. I met Jennifer Walsh at a roadside diner 50 miles from town, far from Meridian's sphere of influence. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a digital recorder that she placed carefully between us on the scratched Formica table. "Mrs. Foster, before we begin, I need you to understand what you're getting into," Jennifer said, her voice serious. "If we publish this story, Titan Industries will come after both of us with everything they have. They'll hire investigators to dig into your past, lawyers to threaten lawsuits, and public relations firms to destroy your credibility." "They're already threatening me," I replied, sliding copies of the intimidation letters across the table. "And they murdered my husband. I'm not backing down." Jennifer examined the letters carefully, then pulled out a business card, crisp white, with elegant lettering, identifying her as a senior investigative correspondent for the Tribune. This wasn't just any reporter. She was someone with the resources and reputation to take on major corporations. "I've been investigating Titan Industries for 2 years," she explained. "There have been rumors of safety violations, worker intimidation, and suspicious accidents across their facilities. But I've never had solid evidence or witnesses willing to go on the record." I spent the next 3 hours walking Jennifer through everything I'd discovered: David's hidden documentation, Miguel's testimony, the pattern of deaths across multiple facilities, the corporate memo discussing permanent resolution of the Foster problem. When I played the recordings from David's phone, Jennifer's expression grew increasingly grim. The conversations with other workers, the evidence of systematic sabotage, David's final voice, "Message it," painted a picture of corporate murder that was both shocking and undeniable. "This is extraordinary," Jennifer said finally. "Your husband assembled evidence that could bring down not just Meridian Manufacturing, but potentially the entire senior leadership of Titan Industries." She explained her publication strategy. The Tribune would run a multi-part series exposing Titan's crimes, with the first article focusing on David's murder and the deliberate sabotage that caused the fire. Subsequent articles would detail the broader pattern of eliminating whistleblowers and the corporate conspiracy to cover up safety violations. "But we need to be strategic about timing and presentation," Jennifer continued. "Once the first article runs, Titan will mobilize their crisis management team. They'll flood the media with counter-narratives, attack your credibility, and try to bury the story in legal challenges." She'd already contacted her editor and the Tribune's legal team. The newspaper was prepared to fight any attempts at prior restraint or post-publication litigation. They'd dealt with corporate intimidation before and had resources to protect both their reporters and sources. "However, I need you to go on the record with everything. Anonymous sources aren't enough for a story this explosive. You'll need to be the public face of these accusations." I thought about the threatening letters, the break-ins, the warnings about my daughter's safety. Going public would make me a target not just for intimidation, but potentially for the same accident that had killed David. "What kind of protection can you offer?" "Legal protection through the newspaper's attorneys, and we'll coordinate with federal authorities if they're willing to investigate. But I can't guarantee your physical safety, Mrs. Foster. That's a risk you'll have to decide if you're willing to take." I pulled out the final piece of evidence I'd been saving: David's hidden phone itself. My husband knew the risks when he started this investigation. He made this recording the morning he died. I played David's final voice message again, watching Jennifer's reaction as my husband's voice filled the diner. His words about making his death mean something, about not letting more good people die because of corporate greed. He was walking into what he knew might be a trap. I explained. But he went anyway because staying silent would have made him complicit in future murders. Jennifer nodded slowly. And now you're facing the same choice. No, I said firmly, I'm not facing the same choice. David had to decide whether to risk his life for the truth. I'm deciding whether to honor his sacrifice or let his killers win. Jennifer spent another hour explaining the publication timeline and coordinating our security measures. The first article would run the following Sunday, giving her team time to verify facts and prepare for Titan's inevitable counterattack. Mrs. Foster, once this story breaks, your life will never be the same. Titan will paint you as a grief-stricken widow who's lost touch with reality. They'll claim your husband was mentally unstable, that his evidence was fabricated, that his death was simply a tragic accident you've built into a conspiracy theory. Let them try, I said, sliding David's phone and all my documentation into a manila envelope. I have 43 years of marriage to a good man, decades of teaching experience, and a community that knows my character. More importantly, I have the truth. As we prepared to leave, Jennifer handed me her card with her personal cell number written on the back. Mrs. Foster, if anything happens to you between now and publication, anything at all that seems suspicious, me immediately. Your husband died trying to expose these crimes. I won't let his sacrifice be in vain. Driving home through the gathering darkness, I felt a mixture of fear and determination. In 5 days, David's story would reach hundreds of thousands of readers. Titan's conspiracy would be exposed. Their victims would be remembered, and their crimes would face the judgment of public opinion. But I also knew that the most dangerous time was still ahead. Cornered corporations were capable of desperate measures, and I'd just painted the biggest possible target on my back. David's courage had brought me this far. Now I had to find the strength to see his fight through to the end. Titan Industries moved faster than I'd expected. 2 days after my meeting with Jennifer Walsh, a process server appeared at my door with a thick stack of legal documents. The defamation lawsuit was breathtaking in its scope and viciousness. Titan was suing me for $50 million, claiming I'd engaged in a malicious campaign to destroy their reputation through fabricated evidence, false accusations, and conspiracy theories designed to extort money from a grieving corporation. The legal papers painted me as a unstable widow who'd descended into paranoid delusions after her husband's tragic but accidental death. They claimed I'd forged documents, coached witnesses to lie, and conspired with radical activists to destroy an innocent company. Most disturbing were the personal attacks woven throughout the legal filing. Titan's lawyers had dug deep into my past, twisting innocent facts into sinister implications. My husband's financial struggles were portrayed as motive for extortion. My meetings with other widows were characterized as conspiracy to commit fraud. Even my teaching career was attacked. They'd found a parent complaint from 15 years ago and presented it as evidence of unstable behavior toward children. I called the attorney Jennifer had recommended, but his advice was sobering. Mrs. Foster, this isn't really about winning a defamation case. It's about bankrupting you with legal costs and destroying your credibility before your story can gain traction. He explained Titan's strategy. They'd demand extensive depositions that would cost thousands in legal fees. They'd file motions requiring expert witnesses I couldn't afford. They'd drag the case out for years, knowing that most people couldn't survive the financial and emotional pressure. They're also trying to get a gag order that would prevent you from discussing the case publicly. If they succeed, you couldn't cooperate with the newspaper investigation or speak to other reporters. The lawsuit was just the beginning. That afternoon, I received a call from my bank informing me that my accounts had been frozen pending an IRS investigation into suspicious financial activity. When I asked for details, the bank manager could only tell me that federal agents had presented a warrant claiming I was under investigation for tax evasion and insurance fraud. Mrs. Foster, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding, but until it's resolved, we can't allow any transactions on your accounts. Without access to my money, I couldn't hire lawyers, pay bills, or even buy groceries. It was a calculated move designed to make me homeless and helpless. Within weeks, the character assassination campaign began immediately. Anonymous flyers appeared throughout our small town, featuring my photograph alongside text describing me as a disturbed widow spreading lies about local employers. The flyers claimed I was working with outside agitators to destroy jobs in our community. Local businesses that had supported me after David's death suddenly turned cold. When I went to Murphy's Diner for coffee, the usual friendly conversation stopped. Betty Murphy served me quickly, avoiding eye contact, and other customers whispered among themselves as I sat alone. Helen, I think you should know some people are saying you've lost your mind. My neighbor Mrs. Patterson told me when I retrieved my mail. They're saying you're making up stories about David's death to get money from the company. The social isolation was devastating. Friends I'd known for decades began avoiding me, either because they believed Titan's propaganda, or because they feared being associated with someone the company was targeting. But the cruelest attack came through the local newspaper, which ran a front-page story about my harassment campaign against Meridian Manufacturing. The article quoted Richardson extensively, portraying him as a concerned employer trying to help a widow who'd been overwhelmed by grief and conspiracy theories. We've tried to be compassionate toward Mrs. Foster. Richardson was quoted as saying, "We understand that loss can sometimes lead people to seek someone to blame, but we can't allow false accusations to destroy the livelihoods of hardworking families in our community." The article mentioned that I'd been soliciting other families to join her crusade against local industry and suggested I was being manipulated by outside interests with anti-business agendas. Reading those lies in our local paper where I'd been featured as Teacher of the Year, where David's heroic death had been front-page news just months earlier, felt like watching my entire life being rewritten by corporate propagandists. The final blow came when Sarah called from Colorado, her voice tight with worry and confusion. "Mom, someone called my office claiming to be a journalist investigating your accusations against Dad's company. They asked questions about your mental health, whether you'd been acting strangely, if the family was concerned about your behavior." I realized Titan was trying to use my own daughter to undermine my credibility. They wanted her to publicly express concern about my mental state, adding family testimony to their character assassination campaign. "Sarah, don't talk to anyone about this. They're trying to destroy my reputation so people won't believe what I'm saying about your father's death." "Mom, what really happened? Are you in danger?" I wanted to tell her everything, but I also knew that the more she knew, the more they could target her. "Your father discovered that his company was covering up safety violations that got workers killed. They murdered him to keep him quiet, and now they're trying to silence me." The silence on the other end stretched for a long moment. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice strong and clear. "What do you need me to do?" Despite everything, the lawsuit, the frozen accounts, the character assassination, the social isolation, I felt a surge of hope. My daughter believed me. After 43 years of marriage to a good man and 35 years of teaching, she knew my character well enough to see through corporate lies. "Stay safe," I told her, "and trust that I'm going to finish what your father started." As I hung up the phone, I looked at the defamation lawsuit lying on my kitchen table. $50 million in threatened damages, my reputation in ruins, my finances frozen, my community turned against me. But David's hidden phone was still secure in that safety deposit box, and Jennifer Walsh was still preparing to publish the truth. Titan's desperate counterattack proved how much they feared exposure. They could destroy my life, but they couldn't change the facts. And sometimes, the truth was worth any price. In my darkest hour, support came from the most unexpected source. Tom Bradley, the union representative who'd remained suspiciously quiet since David's death, appeared at my door on a rainy Tuesday evening with a manila folder clutched against his chest. "Mrs. Foster, I need to talk to you," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "What I'm about to show you could cost me my job, my pension, everything, but I can't live with myself anymore." Tom had worked for the Steelworkers Union for 23 years, representing Meridian employees in contract negotiations and grievance procedures. I'd always assumed his silence meant he was either corrupt or cowardly. The truth was more complicated. "Helen, the union leadership has been compromised for years," Tom explained, opening his folder on my kitchen table. "Titan doesn't just buy off politicians and regulators, they own us too." The documents he showed me revealed a systematic corruption scheme that had neutered the union's ability to protect workers. Titan had been funneling money to union officials through consulting contracts, speaking fees, and donations to their personal charities. In exchange, the union agreed to downplay safety concerns, discourage workers from filing complaints, and suppress information about workplace deaths. Every time a worker tried to report safety violations, we were supposed to handle it internally, Tom continued. "We'd file the paperwork but never follow up. We'd tell workers their concerns were being addressed while doing absolutely nothing. The union files contained devastating evidence of systematic cover-ups. David's safety reports had been submitted to union leadership months before his death, detailing the exact violations that would eventually kill him. Instead of demanding action, union officials had buried the reports and warned David to stop making waves. We knew about the gas line problems, the faulty equipment, the chemical storage violations, Tom said, his voice breaking. We knew people were going to die, but we were more concerned about protecting our relationship with management than protecting our members. I stared at the documents, feeling sick. The union that was supposed to advocate for workers like David had been actively working to silence them. Tom showed me correspondence between union leadership and Titan executives, coordinating responses to worker complaints and developing strategies to discredit troublemakers. Why are you telling me this now? Tom's shoulders sagged with the weight of years of compromise and corruption. Because your husband was a good man who trusted us to have his back, because I've got grandchildren. And I don't want them growing up in a world where companies can murder workers and get away with it. He explained that not all union members were part of the corruption. A group of younger representatives had been quietly documenting the leadership's betrayal, building their own case for internal reform. When they learned about my investigation, they decided it was time to act. We're prepared to testify about the union's complicity, Tom said. We'll provide documentation, recorded conversations, financial records, everything you need to prove that this conspiracy reached far beyond Meridian Manufacturing. The union's corruption added another layer to the story Jennifer Walsh was preparing to publish. It wasn't just corporate executives who'd betrayed workers, it was the very organization that claimed to represent their interests. But Tom's courage inspired others to come forward. Over the next few days, I received calls from current and former Meridian employees who'd been too frightened to speak out while facing intimidation alone. Frank Turner, a maintenance supervisor, provided photographs of safety violations he'd been ordered to ignore. They told us to make cosmetic repairs before inspections, then remove them afterward to save money, he explained. I've got pictures of gas lines held together with duct tape, electrical systems that were fire hazards, chemical storage that violated every safety protocol. Maria Santos brought her husband Miguel to a secret meeting in the church basement, where he provided additional testimony about the day of the fire. There were warning signs all morning, Miguel explained. Strange smells, unusual sounds from the gas lines. We reported it to supervisors, but they told us to keep working. They said shutting down would cost too much money. Even some management employees began reaching out. Janet Phillips, a former safety coordinator, had been fired 6 months before the fire for refusing to falsify inspection reports. She'd kept copies of the real reports, showing the true extent of Meridian's safety violations. Richardson personally ordered me to change inspection results, Janet explained. When I refused, he said I was not a team player and found excuses to terminate me. But I kept the original documents, hoping someday they'd be useful. Most surprising was the call from Dr. Patricia Reeves, the county coroner who'd performed David's autopsy. She requested a private meeting, claiming she had information that could be crucial to my case. Mrs. Foster, I've been struggling with this for months, Dr. Reeves said when we met in her office after hours. The autopsy results I released weren't complete. There were findings that suggested your husband died before the fire reached him. She showed me the complete autopsy report, including sections that had been marked confidential and excluded from the public record. David's injuries were inconsistent with fire damage he'd suffered. Blunt force trauma to the head that occurred before the explosion. Someone struck your husband with a heavy object before the fire started, Dr. Reeves explained. The head injury would have been fatal, or at least incapacitating. He couldn't have been trying to rescue other workers because he was already unconscious or dead. Why didn't you include this in your official reports? I was pressured by my superiors, who claimed releasing this information would interfere with the ongoing investigation. They said federal authorities would handle the sensitive aspects of the case, but no federal investigation ever materialized. Dr. Reeves had copies of her complete findings, X-rays showing the head trauma, and documentation of the pressure she'd faced to alter her conclusions. Her evidence transformed David's death from suspicious accident to obvious murder. As unlikely allies emerged from unexpected places, I realized that Titan's corruption had created its own opposition. People who'd been forced to compromise their principles were looking for redemption. Employees who'd been silenced were finding their voices. Even those who'd been complicit were recognizing that some lines shouldn't be crossed. The web of corruption that had protected Titan for years was beginning to unravel, pulled apart by the courage of ordinary people who'd decided that truth mattered more than personal security. David's investigation had planted seeds that were finally beginning to grow, nurtured by the conscience of people who refused to let corporate murder go unpunished. The Tribune's expose broke on a Sunday morning that changed everything. Jennifer Walsh's front-page story, titled "Death by Design: How Corporate Conspiracy Killed Whistleblower David Foster," sent shockwaves through our community and beyond. The article laid out the evidence methodically, starting with David's murder and expanding to reveal the broader pattern of corporate violence across Titan Industries. Jennifer had verified every detail, interviewed dozens of sources, and assembled a case that was both devastating and undeniable. The centerpiece was David's hidden phone, which contained irrefutable proof of premeditation. The photographs of sabotaged equipment, the recorded conversations with other workers, and David's final voice message painted a picture of systematic murder disguised as workplace accidents. David Foster knew he was walking into a trap, Jennifer wrote, but he went anyway, because he understood that silence in the face of evil makes us complicit in the crimes that follow. The Tribune had coordinated with newspapers in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia to publish simultaneous stories about suspicious deaths at other Titan facilities. The synchronous coverage prevented the company from controlling the narrative or focusing their damage control efforts on a single publication. Within hours, the story exploded across social media and cable news. #JusticeForDavey began trending as people shared their own stories of corporate retaliation and workplace safety violations. The original article was shared hundreds of thousands of times, reaching an audience far beyond anything Titan could hope to suppress. But it was the local reaction that surprised me most. Despite months of character assassination and corporate propaganda, our community rallied around the truth when it was finally presented clearly and completely. Betty Murphy called me that afternoon, her voice thick with emotion. "Helen, I'm so sorry I doubted you. After reading that article, seeing all the evidence, I can't believe we let them turn us against you." Similar calls came throughout the day. Neighbors who'd been avoiding me, former colleagues who'd been skeptical, even some Meridian employees who'd been afraid to speak out, all reaching out to express support and offer help. The most significant call came from FBI Special Agent Sarah Chun, Dr. Chun's daughter, who'd been following the story from her field office in Chicago. "Mrs. Foster, the Bureau has been watching Titan Industries for several months, based on allegations from other facilities. Your husband's evidence provides the missing pieces we needed to build a federal case." Agent Chen explained that multiple FBI field offices were conducting coordinated raids on Titan facilities across 4 states. They'd obtained warrants to seize financial records, internal communications, and executive files based on the evidence Jennifer had published. "We'll need your full cooperation, but I want you to know that you'll have federal protection from this point forward. Your courage in coming forward has potentially saved countless lives." The corporate response was swift and predictable. Titan issued a statement calling the Tribune article a collection of fabricated evidence and conspiracy theories, promoted by disgruntled former employees and activists with anti-business agendas. They announced plans to sue the newspaper for libel and demanded criminal investigations into what they termed fraudulent allegations designed to extort money from a respected corporation. Richardson held a press conference where he portrayed himself as the victim of a vindictive campaign. Helen Foster is a grief-stricken widow who's been manipulated by outside agitators seeking to destroy American manufacturing jobs. He declared, "These baseless accusations are an insult to the memory of her husband, who died a hero trying to save his coworkers." But Richardson's performance fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. When reporters asked about specific documents and recordings, he deflected or claimed they were taken out of context. When pressed about the forensic evidence of sabotage, he insisted that accidents happen in industrial settings and that Monday morning quarterbacking wouldn't bring back the victims. More damaging to Titan's credibility were the additional witnesses who came forward after the article's publication. Workers from across their corporate empire began contacting reporters with their own stories of retaliation, cover-ups, and suspicious accidents. The union corruption angle proved particularly explosive. Tom Bradley's revelations about purchased union officials prompted federal investigations into labor racketeering, Union members began demanding accountability from leaders who'd betrayed their trust and sold out worker safety for corporate money. By Monday evening, Titan's stock price had dropped 28%. Major pension funds announced they were divesting from the company pending the outcome of federal investigations. Several institutional investors called for the immediate resignation of senior executives. The original fire report, the one that had quickly concluded the explosion was accidentally, came under intense scrutiny. Jennifer's follow-up articles revealed that the lead investigator had received consulting payments from Titan in previous years, creating obvious conflicts of interest that had never been disclosed. Dr. Reeves, the county coroner, held her own press conference to reveal the complete autopsy findings she'd been pressured to suppress. The medical evidence of David's murder sparked demands for criminal charges against whoever had killed him before the explosion. David Foster was struck in the head with a blunt object, causing fatal injuries that occurred before the fire reached him, Dr. Reeves explained to a roomful of reporters. This was not an accident. This was not a heroic death during a rescue attempt. This was cold-blooded murder. As I watched the press conference from my living room, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and grief. David's name was finally being cleared, his real story finally being told. But it had taken months of struggle, intimidation, and near ruin to force the truth into the light. That evening, I received a call from Jennifer Walsh. "Helen, there's something else you should know. We've obtained the original fire investigation report, the real one that was suppressed. The document she'd acquired through FBI sources contained the findings that had been buried to protect Titan. The investigators had initially concluded that the explosion resulted from deliberate sabotage, not equipment failure. They'd found evidence of tampering with gas lines, disabled safety systems, and a timing device that had triggered the blast. But within 48 hours of completing their investigation, the federal team had been reassigned and their findings classified. A new team had issued the sanitized report that blamed equipment failure, closing the case before any real investigation could begin. David's murder was planned at the highest levels of corporate management, Jennifer explained, and the cover-up involved federal officials who were either corrupted or intimidated into suppressing the truth. As I processed this final revelation, I understood that David's death had exposed more than corporate crime. It had revealed the systematic corruption of institutions designed to protect ordinary citizens from powerful interests. But it had also proved that truth has its own power, and that courage can inspire others to stand up against seemingly insurmountable odds. David's investigation had lit a fuse that was still burning, threatening to expose the entire network of corruption that had protected corporate killers for years. The truth was finally free, and no amount of money or influence could put it back in the shadows, where it had hidden for so long. The federal investigation moved with surprising speed. Once the FBI had the evidence they needed, within 6 weeks of the Tribune's expose, a federal grand jury in Chicago handed down indictments against 17 Titan Industries executives, including CEO Marcus Whitman and regional manager James Richardson. The charges were staggering in their scope: conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, obstruction of justice, criminal negligence resulting in death, and violation of federal workplace safety laws. The indictment painted a picture of systematic corporate violence that extended far beyond David's murder. I testified before the grand jury on a cold February morning, telling David's story to 23 citizens who listened with expressions of growing horror and outrage. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Santos Miguel's daughter, who'd become a federal lawyer partly because of her father's experiences at Meridian, guided me through the evidence with respectful professionalism. "Mrs. Foster, in your opinion, did your husband know his life was in danger when he continued his investigation?" she asked. "Yes," I replied, looking directly at the grand jurors. David knew they were capable of killing to protect their secrets, but he also knew that staying silent would make him complicit in future murders. He chose truth over safety, because that's the kind of man he was. The grand jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning indictments on all counts. Several jurors approached me afterward, expressing their sympathy and admiration for David's courage. "Your husband was a hero," one elderly man said, gripping my hand firmly. "Not because he died in a fire, but because he was willing to risk everything to protect his fellow workers." The trial became a media sensation, drawing national attention to corporate accountability and worker safety. Journalists from across the country descended on our small town, transforming the federal courthouse into the center of a larger conversation about the price of unchecked corporate power. Richardson's trial came first, and I attended every day of testimony, watching him in his expensive suit, surrounded by high-priced lawyers. I remembered the man who'd sat in my living room, offering blood money for silence. He'd seemed so powerful then, so confident in his ability to control the narrative and bury the truth. But power built on lies and corruption proved surprisingly fragile. When exposed to daylight, the prosecution presented David's evidence methodically, each document and recording building an irrefutable case of premeditated murder. Miguel's testimony was particularly powerful, his simple honesty contrasting sharply with the defense's attempts to portray him as a confused immigrant seeking attention. The most damaging witness was Janet Phillips, the former safety coordinator, who'd been fired for refusing to falsify reports. Her testimony revealed the systematic nature of Titan's safety violations and Richardson's personal role in covering up dangerous conditions. Mr. Richardson told me that safety regulations were suggestions for companies that can't manage risk effectively, Phillips testified. He said that smart managers knew how to protect profits while giving regulators the appearance of compliance. The defense strategy was predictable, but ineffective. Richardson's lawyers claimed he was a scapegoat for corporate decisions made above his level, that he'd been following orders from Titan headquarters. They argued that David's death was a tragic accident that had been sensationalized by media, attention, and family grief. But the evidence was overwhelming. David's recorded conversations captured Richardson explicitly threatening workers who reported safety violations. The forensic analysis of the explosion proved deliberate sabotage. Dr. Reeves's testimony about David's head injuries demolished any claim of accidental death. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Richardson showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but his wife sobbed openly in the gallery. I felt no satisfaction in her pain. She was another victim of her husband's choices, another family destroyed by corporate greed. Richardson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Patricia Williams, a no-nonsense federal judge with 30 years of experience, delivered a scathing assessment during sentencing. Mr. Richardson, you perverted your position of authority to orchestrate the murder of a decent man whose only crime was caring about the safety of his fellow workers. Your actions weren't just criminal, they were evil. You betrayed every value that makes civilized society possible. The judge continued. David Foster died because he believed in truth and justice. You will spend the rest of your life in prison because you believed only in power and profit. I hope other corporate executives will learn from your example that no amount of money or influence places anyone above the law. The subsequent trials of other Titan executives followed similar patterns. Some attempted to cooperate with prosecutors, hoping for reduced sentences in exchange for testimony against their colleagues. Others maintained their innocence despite overwhelming evidence. CEO Marcus Whitman received a 25-year sentence after being convicted of racketeering and conspiracy charges. His conviction was particularly significant because it established corporate leadership's direct culpability for crimes committed at the facility level. The civil lawsuits followed quickly. Our wrongful death suit against Titan resulted in a $12 million settlement. But more importantly, it established legal precedents that would protect other families seeking justice for corporate violence. Betty Martinez, the Kowalski family, Dr. Chen, and dozens of other families filed similar suits. The combined legal exposure forced Titan into bankruptcy, with their assets liquidated to pay victims and their facilities sold to companies with better safety records. The union corruption trials were equally satisfying. Several union officials received federal prison sentences for accepting bribes and betraying their members' trust. Tom Bradley, who'd testified as a government witness, helped lead the reform movement that cleaned house in the local union leadership. But perhaps the most meaningful consequence was the change in federal workplace safety enforcement. David's case became the catalyst for new regulations requiring independent safety inspections, mandatory reporting of worker deaths, and criminal penalties for executives who covered up safety violations. The David Foster Workplace Safety Act, passed by Congress 18 months after his death, created federal protections for whistleblowers and required companies to maintain independent safety monitoring systems. The law ensured that David's sacrifice would protect workers for generations to come. As I sat in the courtroom listening to Richardson's life sentence, I thought about David's final voice message and his hope that his death would mean something. Justice had been served, criminals had been punished, and systemic changes would protect other families from experiencing our tragedy. David's courage had inspired others to stand up against corporate power, proving that ordinary people could defeat seemingly insurmountable odds when they refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The guilty verdicts couldn't bring David back, but they honored his memory and vindicated his sacrifice. Truth had triumphed over power, and justice had finally been served. 2 years after David's death, I stood in the memorial garden we'd created on the former site of Meridian Manufacturing's East Wing, the place where my husband had been murdered. The twisted metal and chemical-stained concrete had been replaced with native wildflowers, walking paths, and a granite monument bearing the names of all workers who'd died because of corporate negligence. The centerpiece was a bronze plaque with David's photograph and his final words, "Some truths are worth the risk." Below it, an inscription read, "David Foster and his fellow workers died fighting for safety, dignity, and justice in the workplace. Their sacrifice reminds us that ordinary people can change the world when they refuse to accept injustice as inevitable." Sarah had flown in from Portland for the dedication ceremony, bringing my grandchildren to see the memorial to their grandfather. 8-year-old Emma placed a bouquet of wildflowers at the base of David's plaque, while 6-year-old Michael asked why Grandpa had to die for doing the right thing. "Because sometimes bad people try to hurt good people who tell the truth," I explained, kneeling beside him. "But your grandfather was brave enough to fight for what was right, even when it was dangerous." "Are you brave like Grandpa?" Emma asked. I thought about the past 2 years, the intimidation, the legal battles, the financial struggles, the character assassination, and ultimately the triumph of truth over corporate power. "I'm trying to be," I said. The memorial garden had become more than just a tribute to the dead. It was a gathering place for families affected by workplace violence, a symbol of hope for communities fighting corporate abuse, and a reminder that individual courage could create lasting change. Dr. Chen's nonprofit had established a permanent office adjacent to the memorial, providing legal assistance to workers facing retaliation for reporting safety violations. Tom Bradley, who'd lost his union position but gained his now worked as a community organizer, helping other workers find their voices. Miguel Santos had become the memorial's volunteer caretaker, tending the flowers and greeting visitors who came to pay their respects. His English had improved dramatically over the past 2 years, and he'd become an eloquent speaker about workplace rights and the importance of standing up to corporate abuse. "Mrs. Forster," Miguel said, as we walked among the wildflowers after the ceremony, "I think about Mr. David every day when I work in this garden. He would be proud of what his sacrifice accomplished." The changes extended far beyond our small town. The federal workplace safety reforms had prevented dozens of suspicious accidents at industrial facilities across the country. Whistleblower protections had encouraged workers to report violations without fear of retaliation. Corporate executives now faced real criminal penalties for covering up safety problems. Jennifer Walsh had won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigation into Titan Industries, and her reporting had inspired similar exposes of corporate crime across the country. She'd become a close friend over the past 2 years, often visiting to discuss new cases of corporate malfeasance and worker exploitation. David's story changed everything, Jennifer told me as we sat on a bench overlooking the memorial garden. It proved that corporate power isn't invincible, that ordinary people can hold the powerful accountable when they have the courage to speak truth. My own transformation had been profound. The shy, grieving widow who'd been offered blood money 2 years ago had become a nationally recognized advocate for workplace safety and corporate accountability. I spoke at conferences, testified before congressional committees, and worked with families facing similar struggles against corporate power. The financial settlement from Titan had allowed me to establish the David Foster Foundation, which provided legal assistance to families seeking justice for workplace deaths and supported legislation strengthening worker protections. Every dollar that had been intended to buy my silence was now funding the fight for justice and truth. But the most meaningful change was personal. The isolation and fear I'd experienced after David's death had been replaced by purpose and community. I'd discovered strengths I never knew I possessed and found meaning in continuing David's fight for worker safety and corporate accountability. As the sun set over the memorial garden, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. I felt David's presence in the gentle evening breeze that rustled the wildflowers. He'd died believing that truth mattered more than personal safety, that justice was worth any sacrifice. His faith had been vindicated. The corrupt executives who'd ordered his murder were spending their lives in federal prison. The company that had prioritized profits over human life had been destroyed. The workers they'd exploited and endangered now had legal protections and advocates fighting for their rights. Most importantly, David's story had inspired others to stand up against seemingly insurmountable odds. Across the country, workers facing corporate retaliation drew strength from his example, knowing that ordinary people could defeat powerful interests when they refused to be silenced. I touched the bronze plaque bearing his photograph, remembering the last morning we'd shared together, when he'd kissed my cheek and promised to drive carefully. Neither of us had known it would be our final goodbye, but I was grateful that our last words had been, "I love you." "You did it, David," I whispered. "Your truth survived their lies. Your courage inspired others. Your sacrifice changed the world." As I walked home through the gathering darkness, I carried with me the knowledge that love and truth could triumph over greed and power. David's memory lived on not just in the memorial garden, but in every worker who felt safer because of the reforms his death had inspired, every family that found justice because of the precedents his case had established. His legacy was a world where corporate executives couldn't murder workers with impunity, where truth-tellers were protected instead of silenced, where ordinary people could hold the powerful accountable for their crimes. It wasn't the future we'd planned together, but it was a future worth his sacrifice and worth my continuing fight to protect it.